Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this conversation. This is the session, another session of the book talk series of the Religion and IR webinar. I am Jocelyne Cesari. I'm the chair of the Religion and International Relations section of the ISA. And in this capacity, it's my pleasure and honor to convene these sessions. And today I am very happy to welcome you to this panel discussion on contesting pluralism, Islamism, liberalism, and nationalism in Turkey and beyond. The new book of Dr. Nora Fisher-Onar, published this year by Cambridge University Press. I won't be very long, but in the volatile context in which we are living now, contesting pluralism is very timely and vital because it challenges lots of the assumptions we have in both Western political analysis and global international relations. So I will give the floor to Nora for 10 minutes. And then in the order you have on your program, I will give the floor to Dr. Nathan Brown, professor at George Washington University, to Dr. Banu Gökçe from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Dr. Peter Mandaville, professor at George Mason University. So without further ado, Nora, the floor is yours for 10 minutes. Yeah.
I will do my very best to squeeze it into 10 minutes. Of course, it's been a labor of love of many years, and it's always challenging, especially when there's such amazing people in the room who I want to share, so much of the project with. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right in. So basically, this book emanates, let me start from the slideshow. This book emanates from a source of frustration that I think many of us feel who work on Turkey, the Middle East, on Islam, on non-Western world regions. And that is the persistence of Orientalist or Eurocentric optics when reckoning with developments in such context. So in the case of Turkey, there's this kind of obsessive focus on the hyper agencil despotism, Oriental despotism of the leadership, and this usage of tropes that are really evocative of a long-standing Orientalist repertoire, but that might not tell us very much about the complexity of people's processes and mechanisms at play in shaping outcomes like political openings and closures in the country. And so this is these sort of Orientalist binaries. They're part of the Western gaze. They've also been internalized in many respects over the course of centuries of encounter between analysts based in the West and analysts situated in emic context. And of course, they do refer to some of these binaries like Western versus Oriental, or Islamist versus secularist, which is a derivative of that, or Islamist versus the democrat or democracy, Islamism versus democracy, are all they do speak to certain cleavages, but they are very reductionist in the way that they approach them, as are other binaries that are commonly used to make sense of the Turkish political context. And this is really just trying to move the participant bar here a little bit so I can easily change the slides. So this is quite frustrating because we have when you're situated in the region, you have a much more granular understanding of the causal forces at play and determine key outcomes like elections and protests and coup d'etat, revolutions. And you realize that there's a lot of counterintuitive relationships and partnerships, alliance making and breaking that shapes things. That's what these pictures attest to. Can come back to these in the Q&A and unpack. But in a nutshell, the meta narrative doesn't match and doesn't help us make sense of the real world challenges and outcomes in the country and the region. And this leads to all sorts of consequences. Not only when you misdiagnose you're not only not doing justice to the lived realities of peoples and places that constitute most of our world in our field of world politics and international relations, but you're also perpetuating dualisms that get uploaded to the Western political science and policymaking mainframe in ways that mean that we've been blindsided when we think of, authoritarianism as being something oriental that happens out there, and democracy as being something sort of intrinsic to the Western experience, and therefore the creeping forms of state capture by authoritarian movements in multiple Western contexts that we're currently grappling with, that you mentioned just now, Jocelyn, as well, are overlooked oftentimes in our analysis. Lots of consequences for the Muslim majority world, basically support for authoritarianism, secularism, or Islamism otherwise, because if democracy is not possible in Muslim majority context, then you have then you might as well just cooperate in marriages of convenience with secularist or Islamist authoritarian regimes. And that not only discounts the democratic aspirations of pro-religious and pro-secular among many others across the Muslim majority world, but it also results, again, in the feedback loop, results in restrictive immigration policies and selective attention to human rights and human suffering in and beyond the region, and in fueling right-wing nationalism and populism and state capture in the West. So how to get beyond the binaries. That's what my book is about. It starts from the cover. The cover is about getting beyond binaries, but we can return to the cover in the Q&A. I'm in love with this cover. It was a journey to come up with it. So would love to return to that. But what I'm going to do with my very short time is to walk you through mostly chapter 2, which is the theoretical framework for the book, and which I think is maybe the most novel contribution to Turkish Middle Eastern studies, perhaps, but also hopefully to comparative politics and towards a reading of international relations in a decentered, more pluralistic sense that also foregrounds perspectives from non-Western sites. So basically, if you're going to break a binary, you need to change your analytical apparatus, because we're kind of trained to think, of course, this is an oversimplification, but we're trained to think in sort of independent, dependent variable terms that have an intrinsically binary relationship baked into the epistemology. And yet there's a whole body of theory out there in many very serious disciplines, organizational sciences, natural sciences, as well as the social sciences, which does read the world through complexity-based epistemology. And it's complexity theory, or complex systems thinking, or chaos theory. And so what I've done is I've kind of taken that logic, and I've interpreted political systems, Turkey's, but also the United States, France, Japan, wherever the case may be. Political systems are complex systems constituted by 3 interactive parameters. So they're kind of like variables, but they're not static, or they're not involved in a linear cause and effect relationship. They're interactive parameters. And it's the interplay between them that generates patterns of continuity and change over time, which can culminate in dramatic, transformative, or critical junctures that can shift the system's trajectory. So briefly, very briefly, the 3 parameters are ideational. That's the isms that are in the title of the book, the isms that are centered in a lot of this presentation, but they're not monolithic isms. They don't have causal force in and of themselves. They're normative and discursive repertoires. They're plastic. They evolve. They're appropriated by actors in response to shifting opportunities and challenges. So actors, in this case, the second parameter, are both, calculating, instrumental, but also performative. They may also be sincere. We don't know. We can't get in their heads. But we do know is what we can measure is how they take ideas and channel them towards achieving certain political outcomes or pursuing them in response to micro-level structures and processes. So micro-level structures would be structures that a human agent could change conceivably within a given period of time. Meso-level structures are structures that take, a lot of human beings a lot of time to transform slowly. And macro-level structures are, generally speaking, beyond the capacity of any human agents to really change. And so actors are nested within these structures, and in order to navigate them, to achieve political outcomes, they channel ideational repertoires. And that is the thrust of this framework. It's very nimble, it's very simple, and then I apply it towards the substantive part. So that's the methodological kind of analytical descriptive framing and toolkit. I then applied substantially to asking, how do actors choose to manage the default social diversity that characterizes all of our societies? There's no uniformly, monolithic society on planet Earth. So we're all challenged with the question of how to live with others. And we all have different visions that evolve over time, that change. I might feel slightly differently about how I want to live with others today than I felt yesterday, than I felt 5 years ago, than I'll feel in 10 years. And so actors' motives are complex and fluid. And this results in sometimes actors taking more hardline positions, sometimes taking more moderate positions. It's dispositional, but it's not baked in concrete or baked in stone, whatever metaphor you want to use. Views can change in response to changing circumstances, in response to changing incentives. And so you have movement across camps of actors embracing different permutations of religious pluralisms, different permutations of ethnic pluralisms, different permutations of gender pluralism, or really pursuing a unitary vision of what the ethnic collective should look like, a unitary vision of what the religious or sectarian collective should look like, or a unitary vision of what our gender identities are, or binary, I guess in that case. And so here the idea is that it's not Islamist versus secularist, or Islamist versus Democrat, or Republican versus Democrat. It's coalitions of people who are more or less open to sharing space with people who look, speak, believe, or love like they do, or differently than they do, and people who want everybody to look, speak, love, or believe like they do. So it's coalitions of pluralizing and anti-pluralist actors. This is my my new key to politics in Turkey and beyond. I apply the key using extensive primary and secondary sources in English and Turkish, historical and historiographic sources, journalistic materials, survey materials. I conducted over 100 interviews with leading commentators over the course of some 15 years of participant observation in the country. A couple more tools in there that I can talk about when time permitting. But what I essentially end up doing is taking this analytical descriptive framework, looking how ideational, agental, and structural parameters interact to generate forms of continuity and change over time that can lead to critical junctures that result in the opening and closing of the political system in terms of willingness to share space with those one perceives as different from oneself. And applying this sort of retroactively to a rereading of 200 years of late Ottoman and contemporary Turkish political history, I was able to pinpoint 7 eras when pluralizing coalitions were able to push through quite radical forms of transformation that opened up the society. So that's what the book is about. It traces between chapters 2 to 8 the contestations between coalitions for pluralism, specifically focused on the sort of intersection of religious and ethnic identity, but then that radiates and spills over into considerations about pluralism in other arenas like gender or politics or media. And essentially, at the end of the day, I was able to pinpoint 7 coalitions to date. We can dive into my periodization if anyone wants me to unpack it more in more detail. During these 7 periods, actors were able to push through outcomes like a commitment to universal justice, to minority rights, to multicultural citizenship, to constitutionalism, to multi-party politics, to mass publics and electorate, to civic nationalism, and even during periods where the sort of the power was in the hands of the anti-pluralist coalition. So sort of the early Republican Turkey was, a regime that was that entailed one-party rule, and in many ways one-man rule, and so in that sense was anti-pluralist. But it had nevertheless elements within the system that I call embedded liberalism that baked in and contributed to the ability of pluralizers to ultimately push through these liberal with a lowercase l outcomes that I highlight here in on this slide. By way of contrast, they are the sort of rival forces, rival coalitions, or coalitions that advocate for one or another form of ethno or ethno-religious nationalism, Turkish Islamic or Turkish Islamist synthesis. They are generally speaking perhaps more successful in capturing the state, but the contests are alive and well, as we see in recent protests in Turkey to this day. Interestingly, the sort of secularist versus Islamist cleavage that we're so often told is a driver of contestation in Turkey and many other contexts, is really pronounced only twice in this entire 200 plus year tableau that I survey. So that's the kind of the empirical takeaways. What are the broader takeaways for interdisciplinary area studies and comparative area studies, for comparative politics and for international relations? When it comes to Turkish politics, or Turkish area studies, Middle Eastern area studies, many in the room will be familiar with a seminal thesis about the way things operate in Turkey called the center periphery thesis. And my contention is, I don't have time to go into it right now, but my contention is that it helps to, that this book helps to both revamp and revitalize, but also correct for some of the problems associated with this thesis. In a nutshell, it's not center periphery or Islamist or secularist, it's pluralized in an anti-pluralist coalitions. But this is not just I'm really committed to the beyond part of the book's title and to this project of cross-case and cross-regional learning. And my contention is that because this analytical, descriptive, complexity-informed framework is so culturally thin, it allows us to capture sort of granular details and dynamics in a non-reductionist way, but it doesn't require that we situate the analysis only in one country or only in one world region. And so we can map the causal interplay of actors, ideas, and evolving contextual and structural features of a political system, trace the emergent properties, how they might lead to transformative or critical junctures, shaping openings and closings for the system across cases. And here I have a list of various other cases where we confront fraught contest between advocates of political religion, as Muslim nationalism, Jewish nationalism, Christian nationalism, Hindu nationalism, Buddhist nationalism, you name it. There's a nationalist variant of that religion, and how are they confronting forces within those society, coalitions across camps that seek to maintain more pluralistic national projects. And with that, I will close, but just wanted to throw out there as a possible exercise. We can, in order to show you how this travels, I'd be happy to try and apply this framework to recent developments in Turkey over the past few weeks and months that have seized a lot of interest. And I think this framework, the book brings us almost up into this point. It brings us to 2024, late 2024 in a way. So the framework can be extended longitudinally into the Turkish context. One more year is nothing over the arc of 200, but it can also be, I think, extended as in a comparative framework to making sense of where we stand, for example, in the United States right now. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for respecting the time, Nora. So I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Brown for 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Jocelyn, for including me, and Nora for giving us this occasion for discussion. I'm not brought here presumably for my deep knowledge or expertise in Turkish politics, because it's a place I've never worked. But I have had to pay attention some decades ago in order to prepare for my comprehensive exams. And then on a continuing basis, actually, a lot of my interest is in patterns of state formation in the Middle East, and especially in the Arab world, where I just keep on bumping into Ottoman patterns and Ottoman inheritance and so on. So I'm a consumer rather than a producer of scholarship here. And I'm going to focus my remarks there. So is this a new account? What is different about this account? Well, my answer would be nothing and everything. Nothing in the sense that when I read the various empirical chapters, right, I come across familiar events, familiar political parties, leaders, Özal and Erdogan and so on, and coups and failed coups and so on. So I know the broad details of the story. She's not saying we need to understand completely different people or completely different events. But it's new in the binaries that she was talking about are ones that dominated understanding of Turkish politics and Turkish political history when I was back in grad school, and they were clearly beginning to fall apart then. I mean, there were things like the way people lined up on EU membership, the election of Ozal, the way groups positioned themselves with each other, it was sort of breaking down. So what she's trying to do is to give us, I think, a sort of a framework for understanding that is just a little bit more sophisticated. She doesn't dismiss the old binaries, but she sees them as less binary, less rigid, less timeless. So she's telling a familiar story in an unfamiliar way. And what I want to do in most of my remarks is turn to the central concept of pluralism, on which she's orienting it. Pluralism is sometimes an idea, sometimes a behavior, sometimes an attitude, sometimes a fact, but it's a way of helping us make sense of this complexity, and what placing it at the center doesn't generate, as I read the book, a set of social science hypotheses subject to verification, right? That's not the kind of book this is. Instead, what I think she's trying to do is to give us a more helpful framework to give a narration, one that focuses on kaleidoscopic interaction, and kaleidoscopic is a metaphor I'm going to come back to, rather than on classic binaries. So I'm not going to attempt to judge her as an expert on Turkish politics. It sounds more plausible to me. It makes more sense than the frameworks that I was given in grad school. But what I want to ask is, does this travel elsewhere? Is this a kind of approach that we could use? Not are these universal rules of politics, because she's not trying to give those, but is this a kind of framework we could use elsewhere? And I think yes, and I'm going to give a couple of reasons why. First, over the last century, 2 centuries or so, the state itself and the scope for politics has simply become so expansive that accounts that reduce it to a single project, idea, or rule obscure much of the contestation, the coalition formation, the rulemaking, the normative debates that do occur. And politics and the state are just so big. People and different kinds of people simply bump into each other an awful lot more, and so something that embraces, I would say, the scope of politics and the scope of the state and its complexities is helpful. What Professor Fisher-Onar does in this book is really, I think, focus a little bit more on sort of top-down accounts of politics. But if you look at this from the bottom up, you'll say, okay, this is actually how people experience. This is how people act in politics. So I think it would be fruitful there. Second, let me say something about the idea of the nation state. We often sort of take the idea of a nation state as something that emerged in Europe and has now transferred itself to the rest of the world, has now triumphed. And I think using this framework, we'd realize that kind of misses something, right? So yes, there is something about a nation state that is now kind of global in nature, but it's not something that, triumphed easily in Europe. The whole struggle there was contested and enormously violent at sometimes. And I'd like to say, by the end of the 20th century, the majority of the population of Europe until the end of the 20th century, the majority of the population of Europe lived in states that were explicitly multinational, right? So this wasn't something that can be sort of seen as a specific historical era that invented it and then resulted. And elsewhere, I think what we see with sort of the rise of the nation state is not an easy triumph, but a central node of political contestation. The struggle between what she's saying, a unitary nation state and a pluralistic vision of politics, is, I think, replicates itself in societies throughout the world. That is close to universal, but the outcome of the struggle is highly particularistic. And even the term outcome doesn't really belong here, because history doesn't end. This is an ongoing process in almost all societies, and it will probably end when we all do, at the end of the world. But the final thing I want to say is there's a couple societies that I know a little bit better than Turkey, where I think this actually helps some things that helps me approach questions that kind of puzzle me. I'm going to mention one small place and one larger place. Small place, Kuwait. Over the last quarter century, actually, well, I shouldn't say even longer, when I would deal with like, the debate in Kuwait is between liberals and Islamists, right? Sometimes when I would close my eyes and talk to these people, I'd say, well, they're saying kind of the same thing. Why don't they get along? And then sometimes they would get along, and sometimes they wouldn't. Even when when they were agreeing, they wouldn't realize it. Sometimes they would disagree but not realize it. There was something an awful lot more complex about this interaction, and reducing Kuwaiti politics to this tug of war, rather than seeing a much more complex set of interactions. Even though it's a small place, there aren't that many Kuwaitis, but still, it was just a much more, it's a much more helpful approach to politics, and even understanding divisions between, Islamists, Salafis, Brotherhood, and this sort of thing among people that are referred to as liberals, between those who are politically liberal, socially liberal, really Arab nationalists, and so on. We begin to see, and you take the view over time, and you see something, as I say, much more complex. And the second place, which is bigger, both in size, but especially in terms of population, is Egypt, right? So back in 2011, the people demanded the fall of the regime, and they got it. And then the people discovered they didn't like each other very much. There was no people, right? There were a lot of people in Egypt. There's over 100 million of them. But the way that they combined, and the way that they identified their adversaries, and the way that they defined their allies was shifted rapidly, sometimes even overnight, in the 2 years after 2011. And the number of these forces or political institutions that saw themselves as really representing Egypt. The revolutionaries, we're representing Egypt. The military, well, all these people are doing politics, we're defending Egypt. Al-Azhar, well, all these people have all these views of politics, but we're the ones who really understand the Egyptian soul. Just the way that people cast their demands, understood their friends, understood their adversaries, understood what they were trying to do, shifted rapidly, and in kind of the ways that she describes. So, conclusion, what I think this book, it doesn't give us a set of laws or hypotheses or causal arguments that we can easily transfer from one setting to another. Instead, I'll conclude just by mentioning that kaleidoscope metaphor again. Viewing society and politics in the way she does lends a lot of complexity, makes it very, very hard to keep track of things, but it's also a much more colorful and richer account of how we act and how we're acted upon in politics.
Thank you, Nathan. Now the floor is to Dr. Banu Gökeriksel. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing.
That's good. Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's really great to be here and to have this opportunity to engage with Nora Fisher-Onar's work. So I found Contesting Pluralisms to offer a really important, timely, and transformative framework for understanding Turkey's complex political history through the lens of pluralizing versus anti-pluralist coalitions. And this is a unique way of approaching the very complex Turkish landscape of Turkish politics. And I approached this, and I read this book as a scholar of contemporary Turkey and a feminist political and cultural geographer that is very interested in every day as a critical analytical category. And I found this approach, the book's approach, really generative for moving beyond conventional binary frameworks that I found to fall apart really easily when you look at ordinary people and everyday life. But these binary frameworks have dominated scholarship and political discourse on Turkish politics for a very long time. So my response engages with the book, especially the theoretical interventions, by bringing them into conversation with my own research on lived experiences of marginalization, sectarian dynamics, and also post-secular geographies in Turkey. So in terms of the theoretical framework of the book, the central contribution of the book is the framing of Turkey's history in quotes from the late Ottoman Empire to the present as a tale of pluralizing versus anti-pluralist coalitions, rather than the reductive Islamist versus secularist, Turk versus Kurd, Sunni versus Alevi binaries. And those are the binaries that have really limited the understanding of Turkish politics. Instead, what Fischer-Onar proposes is that we look at cross-camp alliances that pit those who are willing to coexist with others against those who champion a unitary national project in which everyone speaks, believes, looks, or loves as they do. So the sameness versus difference. And then in the book, Fischer-Onar proposes moving beyond identitarian politics as well and reductive Orientalist frameworks, arguing instead for analyzing contestations between pluralizing and anti-pluralizing forces and shifting alliances across ideological camps. And this really, is really powerful when she looks at the most recent AKP era, when we see different coalitions coming together and breaking apart at different moments that ends up with where we are today. And it's usually, I found that discussion really powerful. For example, in the early 2000s, how there was an Islamist liberal alliance that advocated for democratizing reforms. And then there was an intra-Islamist clash in the early 2010s that accelerated the authoritarian rule of AKP. And then after 2013 Gezi protests and the 2015, this kind of rise of ethno-religious nationalism and another alliance of Islamist secularists, but also nationalist kind of forces. So it's really difficult to explain all these shifting alliances and to a lot of people that I talk to, because it's just puzzling to them. There's a sense that ideologies should be pure and separate and consistent, but it is very much true. And now I have the language to speak of this thanks to this book, that these alliances don't have any ideological purity, and they are actually, they shift in sometimes dizzying ways. And so it's not, in a way, then political ideology does not explain everything, as we're led to believe. And there's a lot more. The book paints a much more practical and opportunistic picture of Turkish politics, where these agile actors, in Nora's words, appropriate elements of overlapping repertoires, including more or less pluralistic variants of Islamism, liberalism, and or nationalism, in strategic and confirmative response to evolving pressures. And then she, proposes, develops this kind of the axes where we see these different combinations, different alliances with their different tendencies towards how to treat others and how much to advocate for unity. So I think all of that is really interesting and opens up a variety of questions, I think, about the Turkish political landscape, where things are not as fixed as it's often thought to be. And there's a lot more kind of fluidity and coming together, and a lot of paradoxes and tensions as well. That maybe, I'd be interested in talking more about, what are those, when those alliances are formed, what are the tensions that arise for the political parties, for the institutions, and often requiring reconfigurations of the relationships between different political actors, but also impacting everyday life as well. So in terms of thinking through some of this, so as I mentioned at the beginning, my research is very much focused on the granular, the micro politics of everyday life. But through my various projects, I've traced very similar dynamics of Islamism as it's lived as part of everyday life, Alevi versus Sunni difference and how that actually comes to play in the relationship between neighbors who live in the same apartment building or in the same neighborhood. What does that difference mean? In terms of refugees, how especially Syrians are seen by residents in Turkey as they become neighbors. So I'm interested in really, like maybe hearing a little bit more about, if we have time, from Nora about, grounding this kind of pluralism in everyday spaces. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is the book, in a way, is suggests doing away with these binaries that we're used to seeing, but it's, on the other hand, proposing another kind of binary, right? Pluralizing versus, anti-pluralist. And the question that I've been asking through my research is like, which differences come to matter, when, how, when a difference becomes irreconcilable and unlivable. And I've heard a lot of stories about this with between Alevi and Sunni neighbors, when all of a sudden, like neighbors who maybe get along really well and living together in close neighborly relations, something happens and then that's no longer possible. So I've been very interested in that. Similarly with Syrians, like there are a lot of kind of things that people mention in my research about language barriers or gendered kind of differences, and how that at a certain time it's seen as posing a threat, invoking anxiety, and making that like national kind of unity impossible in a way. So I'm interested in opening up a little bit of that pluralism, like which differences are marked as a threat at which point in time, and how does that political discourse circulate, and how ordinary people also participate in this. So kind of grounding it a little bit at that level. So in a way, if we think about the neighborhood as a laboratory for pluralism, and these like pluralizing forces as coming to, as lived in the neighborhood and negotiated, what are those kinds of differences that come to matter at those different points of life? And what is that materiality? Like, does it make a difference? How does it make a difference? And I know you're interested in urban space as well, so I don't feel bad asking about this. And in terms of the temporality, like I wonder like if there's a certain temporality to these pluralizing coalitions, and kind of a backlash, and then another moment of actually having a different point of view. So thinking about both the space and temporality of the question of pluralism, I think will be I'm really interested in. And to conclude, I find the book really, really thought-provoking and really opening up, my thinking. And I think it's going to be really, really of interest to scholars of Turkey, but also, as Nathan Brown outlined, will be of relevance to scholars of the Middle East, and more broadly as well. It does come at a moment when there's a crisis of pluralism, of democracy, with the global rise of the far right, including here in the US. So I think there's a lot of actually things to be to get from the book and its conceptualization, and trying to move away from this ideological dogma, and to really think about these much more kind of unexpected alliances that come to form and then break, and to understand the situation in that way, I think will be really helpful. So I'll thank you for the book. Yeah, there.
Thank you very much. And now give the floor to Professor Mandaville.
Great,
Please.
thank you very much, Jocelyn. And try to be as brief as possible so that we have time to hear from Nora as well as to engage with the audience. So, I count myself as one of those who, for many years, has been deeply dissatisfied with the conventional Islam versus secularism, Islam versus democracy type framing of the kind of engine of causality within Turkish politics, but had never really come up with a satisfactory alternative to it. For a while, I was one of those who found some value in kind of adding questions around social class into this formula, particularly when trying to understand the formation and rise of the AKP in the late 90s and early 2000s, and yet the same time, that was never quite right. And so, in that sense, this book really was a breath of fresh air to read because I think it offers a significant advance in that sense that we have a comprehensive, systematic, and I think well thought out way of reframing the core dynamic, within Turkish politics. Like Nathan, when reading it, I couldn't help but kind of see it also as a lens that aided me with hindsight to make sense of certain things that I'd observed in my own work in other contexts. I remember doing work in Europe in the mid 2000s, where I would meet with the leaders of various European Salafi groups. And then, at the same time, meet separately with the leaders of various far-right groups that were anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and was struck by the ways in which the sort of grammar and structure of their grievances were very similar, right? The sort of morphology of argumentation was virtually identical, because what united them was precisely this anti-pluralist orientation. They were both exclusivists within their respective domains. So, I see value there in terms of the applicability of this argument to other settings. So Nora, there are kind of three questions that I want to pose to you. One engages directly with the kind of core categories you're using here, the variables, I guess you might also say. A second is a question about, I guess you would say, levels of analysis maybe, and kind of the ability of the argument to travel. And then finally, kind of a more methodological note. The first question, I think, is a variant of one of the questions that Banu already asked you, which is to observe that, although you frame this as an anti-binary type argument, I think the grammar, the analytic grammar of the social sciences just always forces us into binaries of some sort, right? So you end up having to talk about pluralist, anti-pluralist, secular, religious. But, what I wanted to ask is for you to talk a little bit about how you would compare religious anti-pluralism to secular anti-pluralism, right? Are there qualitative differences in those two forms of anti-pluralism that are significant for us to understand? And where I'm, led in asking this, and again, here I think Banu is going in the same direction, I'm wondering then, what are the limits, right? If anti-pluralism enables collaboration and coalition building to a certain degree, are there some limits that one might eventually reach that are articulated by the qualitative differences between secular and religious variants of anti-pluralism? So that's the first question. The second, I was intrigued by a point, a sort of a claim that you made at the end. On the face of it, reading this, when you think of the conventional subdivision of American political science, on the face of this is a work of comparative politics, right? It's a book that seems to explain political behavior, political coalition building, political outcomes within the context of a specific country. But in the conclusion of the book, you almost as a throwaway point, without kind of unpacking and developing it further, say something about the applicability of this framework to international relations. And so I wanted to just hear a little bit more about that and how you would see these same categories, this same argument, the same framework working for IR. And then finally, also when kind of talking about how this basic set of equipment analytically that you've offered us would be useful for engaging other kinds of problems, you sort of lay out the basic process, starting with initial conditions, borrowing from complexity theory, emergent properties. And I just wanted to, given the kind of processual model that you're committed to and invested in here, I wanted to push a little bit on that idea of starting with initial conditions, right? Because how do you know what the relevant initial conditions to start with are, right? You have to kind of artificially stipulate a certain moment as being the initial conditions, when in fact that moment is itself has been produced through processes. And so I just wanted to understand a little bit more methodologically speaking how you think about that moment of initial conditions where the story begins. But otherwise, I just want to congratulate you and thank you for a book that I really do think is a significant advance in not only how we understand the last couple of decades and beyond that, the last couple of centuries of Turkish politics, but also a set of new tools and gear, social science gear for us to pick up and start playing with in relation to other kinds of settings and problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I will add a few words also before giving back the floor to Nora to respond to some of the points, and maybe this will warm up our audience to ask questions. First, congratulations, that's in order. And I would say that this is a book that is really adding value to this attempt that has been growing to go beyond the binary East-West, secular, religious, politic, democracy, authoritarian. And in this sense, it's an important contribution. There have been lots of work already done to challenge these binaries, but your approach is new and very fresh in the sense that you are looking at this pluralizing behavior or strategy, depending on how you want to look at it. So this is really something to salute. The second thing I like even more, knowing the work I've been doing, is to insist on the relational element of the coalition. It's not that the pluralism is a feature of one group or one party. It is also built in a continuous interaction between ideas, institutions, and actors. And you put this in history. And this is the kind of work that I wish we could see more and more in our discipline, because indeed it does break down the connection between, this is the factor that is explaining this particular situation, the variable approach. And it's about time we get out of the variable approach. I'm going to show my impatience here. I mean, the scientists have left behind the Copernic model. Why do we in social science cannot get rid of it? I'm a little excessive here, but and your work shows that there are other ways to decipher reality that do not need this kind of not only binary, but very static and unidimensional approach to reality, while we know that people live every day in a mess. It's messy. So how much can we simplify this and then lose the relevance of what we are doing? So thank you for that. Then I have a question for you, because reading the book, it's clear that indeed you do this fantastic job at rereading political history of Turkey through this angle, through this lens. and you approach, you show the pluralism at stake in political domain. It's not only coalition, it's about also, do people accept political pluralism or not? And indeed, the boundary is not between the Democrat and the non-Democrat or the secular and the religious. But then you have also the ethnic pluralism, and that's the question of the Kurd that also Banu mentioned. You know, even if you are a Democrat and accept pluralism, how much are you interested in having a recognition of ethnic difference? And then you have the religious pluralism. And so what I was wanting more at the end of the book is a sort of synthesis of that. I mean, because then it's not the same game. You show all this diversity, but how would you identify what I like to call a pattern? There are several patterns, meaning even if people are pluralist or anti-pluralist, they are not pluralist on the same way. and that adding complexity to what you are doing, and that's what would lead to a mapping in a way that you can say, oh, we see through history that there's been this tendency of some groups to go together, converge on some issue, but not on others. So how much of this can also explain not the future, but anticipate, you know, some of the tensions that may happen. And I also agree with all my colleagues here that there is a potential for looking outside. And again, in each country, the question of pluralism doesn't play out the same way. And it is key it's a key to understand political and religious history of Turkey. So it works well, but I think it works also well in other cases. And beyond, indeed, the East or Eastern part of the world. But thank you. So I'm checking if there are anybody who wants to add something from our audience, but Nora, take a few minutes and I'm going to monitor the questions and see if some come up. Please go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for these very heartening and stimulating remarks and feedback, each from your own area and disciplinary positionality that sheds so much light and insight onto, what I've been striving to do, locked in lots of small spaces, working on this manuscript over many years. And many of you have been a part of that journey with me, and I'm just so grateful to be able to share this part of the journey with you as well. But these are also some fantastic questions, and I guess I'll try and kind of answer, get at them a little bit holistically, because there was overlap, between the questions. I think in this notion of kaleidoscope, and then Banu's notion of the sort of the grounded everyday, and Jocelyn's evocation of like we're a mess every day, right? And I might feel one thing and have one set of convictions in the morning, and then I read an op-ed and it puts me in a different frame of mind, and I'm feeling very angry about something adjacent to what I was happy about in the morning in the same day. So I think that it is that. So what I think I share with all of you in terms of inclination, and what was the starting point from this project, is a certain inductive sensibility, and a sense that you have to let the complex realities speak for themselves, and upload that, somehow inductively theorize that into utilizable, nimble frameworks that don't over-determine and don't erase that complexity. And so, I'm doing that as someone who's trained as a international relations and area studies scholar, really, because I did my doctoral work in the UK. And so I agree with Peter that this is, presents as a comparative politics book, but it's a comparative politics. I come to the comparative politics from interdisciplinary area studies, which is why it has the history, and it has the normative philosophy, and the sort of political sociology, and all of that other stuff kind of woven into it, the religion and politics, woven into it. And so, that leads to like maybe a little bit of in Turkish you say like mesleki deformasyon, like a kind of a professional warping. So that while my impulse is very much from the kaleidoscope, the ground up, from the inductive theorizing of the messiness, my sites of analysis are pretty conventional political science, IR, kind of elite sites of analysis or sources of data. So it's, politicians, journalists, leading pundits, and it is really remarkable when I was revisiting the book in preparation for this. There's some figures who are really have been very special in the brokering of pluralizing coalitions. There's a gentleman named Suri Önder who recently passed away in Turkey, for example. I have a section on him in the book. And so, that's the bandwidth and the locus of of the folks who I've been engaging with, who are the ones who are able to mediate those differences, the ones who are the pluralizers. And I do, to Peter's question about the binaries, I do try and really emphasize that it's never a finished project, also to Nathan's point. It's the pluralizing coalitions, and they are different visions of pluralism, and there is frictions, and there's some actors who are particularly apt and empathetic, perhaps, and just able to kind of broker those mediating conversations across camps. But these coalitions are indeed fragile. So I actually just want to kind of go back to the slides really quickly to speak to that point. So I do have in the book a section, I very much take Jocelyn's point to heart. I do have a section in the theoretical chapter that kind of demarcates these different types of pluralism. So there's legal pluralism, indeed, political pluralism, media pluralism, religious pluralism, ethnic pluralism, gender pluralism. And while the focus on this book, because I'm taking as my sort of boogeyman or foil the Islamist versus secularist dichotomy, so the focus of this book is really kind of on the intersections of the religious and the political pluralism. I do think that the framework, this analytical descriptive framework here, can be applied to the ideas at stake that are being mapped out. Doesn't have to be about Islamisms, but it can be about, Kurdish nationalism, Turkish nationalism, and in the case if we were to transport this framework to the United States, white nationalism, Christian nationalism, and so it is in that sense, I hope, just an offering to scholars interested in real world problems and questions that are related to our ability to thrive together in diversity, whether it's coming from political theory, political science, religion and politics, geography, feminism, and different aspects. And I do just hope to offer this kind of framework that I've done the work that I can do in a single manuscript regarding rereading a particularly complex and rich case in both longue durée and perspective, and honing in on the recent transformation of the past 20 years in very granular perspective. And it is indeed my hope that framework can travel. So if I just trying to address your question. So in that sense, yes, it's binaries. That's why I'm careful to, while it still relies on some binaries, it's baked into that meso-level structure of the English language and that meso-level structure of political science language. But I do try and soften these hard binaries by saying this pluralizing coalitions, and it's a process, it's an aspiration, and one might be pluralistic, for example, when it comes to religious pluralism, but have real issues when it comes to gender pluralism, right? Like those two can work across purposes, or you might be anti-pluralist when it comes to political pluralism at home, but very much in favor of, to your IR question, Peter, very much in favor of international pluralism, of a kind of a multipolar world of multiple regions where no other hegemon in another region can tell you what to do. So there are definitely frictions across scales, and there's frictions across substantive areas where these pluralisms happen. But that's where I hope that the sort of the thinness of the complexity-inspired analytical framework can do enough work filtering out in a non-binary way, using, filtering out in a way that captures that relational complexity across different substantive and geographic spaces moving forward. And I really love the idea of also thinking about it in terms of temporality. This will be my last response. And this is, again, what's so wonderful to have a geographer in the room, right? You like insist, like, think about space and time. You know, you have to add that in. And it's obviously implicit in a longue durée story. But I think the temporality part is really where we get at this question of when it falls apart, right? When the differences are just too much to bear. And I can look, when I map it out along durée, and see seven pluralizing coalitions that have come across, you know, just as many anti-pluralist coalitions over the past 200 years. You know, what are the particular catalyzers of making it fall apart? And sometimes, you know, it might be, sometimes it might come from just the fundamental instability in an idea, right? So, for example, in the Islamic liberal coalition of the early 2000s, liberals were really more committed to actually advocating for, within a sort of a liberal secular multicultural framework, a space for Sunni Muslims, along with a space for and really recentering the experience of marginalized ethnic and religious minorities. Whereas for the Islamo partners in the Islamo Liberal Alliance of the early 2000s, it was really about creating as many spaces as possible for Sunni Muslim self-expression, right, and empowerment. And so there were various junctures, and that's where you go from the diachronic story to the synchronic story, you hone in on these critical junctures. There are various junctures where it falls apart, and there's certain triggers, and the trigger might be, you know, a statement made by a politician. The trigger might be an economic crisis. The trigger might be you know, I think in the case of the recent protests in Turkey, for example, it was, I think, very ill-judged that they took away the diploma of the Istanbul mayor, and the impact that the sort of the triggering effect that had on students, because the vast majority of people on the streets in the past few weeks have been youth and university students. It's that idea, they talk about suffocating, right? They say, like, I can't breathe. It's like the like why was it George Floyd instead of, you know, any other victim of racialized violence in the United States? It's because that mechanism of taking away the diploma from someone who was another mediator in terms of his ability, Imam Ola's ability to kind of harness these syncretic languages and repertoires to speak to multiple audiences, was, you know, the catalyst. And so there's never like, I think there are patterns, and I think moving forward, the project is to think about how to identify these patterns in ways that can hopefully help support pluralizers everywhere, from Kuwait to the United States to, you know, Germany. But yes, it will always be an unfinished project, and that's my way of hopefully not succumbing to the binaries, is by recognizing that it's constantly, continuously negotiated, contested, and work in progress.
Thank you, Nora. We are past the hour, but there is a question, and I would like to give it to you before we close. This would be your final position. So the question is, how do you situate your transdisciplinary theoretical thinking in terms of quantum approaches applied across humanities, international studies, and social sciences?
Wonderful question. And this is there's a throwaway to this in the conclusion. So this is the type of question that I've thought about, you know, and I'm excited about. And I think it can, there's promise there, and I have no idea how to operationalize it. And so I would love to whoever asked that question to please reach out to me and let's have a conversation, because, you know, part of what I'm like, if the complexity framework enables you to break the epistemological structure of the binary, right? The Copernican kind of, you know, static cause effect kind of way of viewing things. Obviously, that's been happening in physics for a long time. And indeed, you know, complexity, the whole complexity inspiration comes from the natural sciences. And so I'm certain that there are ways of modeling and coding this type of behavior that don't rely on binary. So I had that throwaway in the conclusion of the book. But I'm not methodologically trained to be able to kind of conceptualize how it is. But given that, you know, in a way, the framework is, like I said, when I try and explain it to students, I use the butterfly effect as a way to kind of explain how, like, small qualitative changes can lead to can lead to holistic, have holistic impacts on system trajectories. Otherwise, I would love to explore this more. It is possible to code and model for complexity. It is possible, and I would love to explore it more in terms of the quantum turn, but I do not know how to do it. So I'm I'm sort of ethnographer at heart, and a little bit political intellectual historian, a little bit political scientist, a little bit political theorist. So I would love to engage with folks who are really on top of that interdisciplinary mediation and conversation in terms of how this could be expanded as a project.
Thank you. That's a sign of a good, promising avenue for expanding the perspective here. Thank you, Nora, and thank you, Nathan, Banu, and Peter for your insights. Thank you to the audience, and see you to a next session of our webinar in the future, not so far away. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Goodbye,
much.
And
everybody.
congratulations, Nora, again.
Thanks so much. Congrats, Nora. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.